Welcome to A Place for Film, the IU Cinema podcast. On this week's episode, we're talking about the Underground film series. All right, hello everyone. Welcome to the show. My name is Andy Hunsucker.
And I'm Jason Thompson.
And on this week's episode, we've got Mark Benedetti, who is one of the programmers of the Underground film series. Are you the lead programmer?
Yeah, I don't know that I've ever had an official title, but something like the lead programmer is perfectly fine.
You're the one who emails everyone to say, what movies do you know?
Right, and compile the blurbs for the program, those sorts of things.
So you're a CMCL grad student, and are you still a projectionist at the cinema?
I am, yes.
Yeah, so Mark is well involved with the cinema, and I went to quite a few of the Underground series last time, and I liked pretty much everything that I saw.
Good.
So Blue really blew me away,
I'm
honestly.
glad that you saw it, and I'm glad that it blew you away.
Yes, and I said this before on the show. It took about 15 minutes before I started hallucinating.
Yeah,
like
you see a lot of things besides blue when you watch that film.
Yes, exactly. So we're going to talk about that a little bit later on. Well, let's go ahead and talk about the Underground film series. So there's let's see, it looks like there's seven screenings this semester. And first of all, let's just give credit to the other people that worked on this. It looks like the same crew that's usually working on it, but maybe.
Yeah, we had. Let me think if I can remember everyone who's involved.
I've got a list here. So.
Laura Ivans-Holly, who's also a projectionist at the cinema. Natasha Ritzma, Russell Schaefer, Mark Hine, who sometimes doesn't show up on the list in the program for some reason, and Andy Urich, and then our faculty advisor, Joan Hawkins.
Okay. So they all had something to do with this series. Now, the first one listed here, we're not going to see, but it's the 50th Anniversary Ann Arbor Film Festival. That one is actually coming up in 2 days before this episode will actually air. So the 50th Anniversary Ann Arbor Film Festival, I'm not familiar at all with the Ann Arbor Film Festival, so tell me about this program.
The Ann Arbor Film Festival is, I believe, the third oldest still running film festival in the country, and it's the oldest that is primarily or significantly devoted to experimental independent film. So their first year was 1963, and the year after their first year, they started doing a traveling package, which is what this is. So they've been doing this for a long, long time, where a panel of I'm not entirely sure who selects the films for the traveling package, but some kind of selection committee picks a set of films that fits into roughly an hour and a half that people around the country and around the world can rent as a kind of snapshot of the festival. But since it's such a long-standing institution in the experimental film world, it's always a really nice snapshot of contemporary goings-on in the experimental film world. It tends to be their selections tend to be sort of classical in a sense. That is, they're usually more film than video. I believe this package is all 16 millimeter. So you won't necessarily get certain kinds of things that people are doing in contemporary experimental video, but nonetheless, it's a really nice way to see what's going on, and the quality tends to be very high because this is really one of the major festival venues for experimental film in the U.S.
Yeah, and I guess I sort of skipped over it. If you're not familiar with the Underground film series, maybe we can talk a little bit about what the Underground film series does.
We show primarily experimental film. We do documentaries as well, sometimes relatively conventional documentaries, sometimes more experimental documentaries. We do the oddball sort of trash cinema film every once in a while, but primarily our focus is on classical, contemporary, experimental, avant-garde cinema.
Yeah. Okay, so that one's Friday, January 25th at 6:30, but that one is not going to be. You'll probably have already seen that if you're interested in this episode.
I hope you all enjoyed it.
Yeah. So the next one listed here, Free Radicals: A History of Experimental Film. This one's Friday, February 8th at 6:30, and this one sounds like a documentary to me.
Yes, I'm actually really excited that we're getting this because I haven't had a chance to see it yet. Last spring, when Chuck Workman was here, we showed Visionaries, which is a kind of primer on, in that case, 1960s underground and experimental film. This is a similar kind of thing with a bit of a broader scope, although it's still mostly U.S. And significantly New York centered. It's a documentary. It's a kind of introductory documentary about experimental avant-garde cinema, primarily in the U.S. It was directed by a guy named Pip Chodorov, who runs a French experimental distributor called Revoir, and who's also a filmmaker himself. Again, I haven't seen it, but I know that it features some film footage and interview segments with a lot of sort of the luminaries of the experimental film world, Jonas Mekas, Stan Brakhage, Ken Jacobs, and others. So if this is a thing that you've been sort of trying to get into at all, or that you maybe are unsure about but may have some interest in, or you're sometimes intimidated or something by it, I think this is probably a really nice way to become at least somewhat more accustomed not only to the kinds of films people make, but to the perspectives from which people are making these films. And maybe you'll get a better sense of why people do the sorts of things they do in experimental cinema.
Cool. So let's talk about real quick how you guys go about selecting the films so people have a general idea. You got a lot of people. Does everyone pick one, or do you sort of decide on a theme, or what?
Usually it's just sort of everybody pick one. We don't really do theme semesters or anything. This semester was a little bit different because a few of these programs are ones that John had brought to me. John had suggested the Ann Arbor Shorts package. Joan had brought this film Empty Quarter to him. Portrait of Jason was already on the schedule because it's the new, as we'll talk about in a second, the new restoration by Milestone Films, and Dennis Douros will actually be here this semester and wasn't able to be here last semester. So that was sort of already in there. So it wasn't quite one per person as it frequently is, but it would still roughly, I mean, that's typically how we do it, roughly one sort of idea. Everyone throws out a few ideas and we kind of cobble together a thing through that.
Okay. Well, the next one listed here is on February 22nd. All these are generally on Friday evenings.
6:30.
Yeah, Friday 6:30. So generally every other week, but there's some skipped dates here. But the next one listed here is Festival of Inappropriation, Friday, February 22nd at 6:30 p.m. So this one is another traveling sort of package?
Yes, this is another traveling shorts package. This is the fourth year of this thing called the Festival of Inappropriation. And it's a festival in name, but it's not a festival like the Ann Arbor Festival is, where they have a location and they have, a week of screenings or whatever, and people go and there's a selection committee and they give out prizes. This is you submit your work to a group of curators and they select, again, roughly an hour and a half worth of work, and then send it around as a traveling package. It's all contemporary found footage. Experimental filmmaking, so using existing images, not necessarily, or in large part not at all, creating your own images to make the work. I haven't seen this year's. I saw last year's, and there were some really amazing pieces. There was one that was made of frames from Viewmaster. So those, the wheels with the tiny little 8mm or whatever size. I think they're actually 10mm or some unusual size film. So it was made entirely from those frames. There was one. There's an example of machinima. I'm sure there's some machinima here, which is films made from video games or video made from video games. There was this amazingly elegiac thing, and it was an incredibly emotional thing for something made from video game glitches. And there was one that used the dashboard video footage from a police car of a high-speed chase, and then the audio was part of the trial of the person who was being chased, and that's all it was for 10 minutes, was just you watching this car driving away from the car. You're sort of in while you're listening to the police explain that scene in court. And it's interesting to note there were some sort of inconsistencies and incongruities between the two accounts. This year's, I haven't seen it, but I know that there's one piece that is some kind of a re-edit or a revision of the famous crop duster sequence from North by Northwest.
Okay.
So that's at least one. And there's also one by this guy Robert Todd, who doesn't usually make work like this, but where he apparently re-edited Star Wars films, selecting just robot sounds and made these weird conversations between robots just with bleeps and bloops.
Wow. This is what that sounds amazing. That sounds really good. So the next one listed here, Portrait of Jason, and Dennis Douros is coming with this. He was supposed to be here last semester, but he was delayed by weather. Superstorm Sandy came through, and he couldn't leave New York. So he just agreed to come back this semester and bring a film with him. And this is another Shirley Clarke film. This one's on Friday, March 22nd at 6:30 p.m. So we didn't really talk much about Shirley Clarke last semester. I didn't go to any of the films, but maybe, I don't know how much you know about her. But
I know a fair amount about her. Shirley Clarke was a really important figure, particularly in 60s independent cinema, New York-centric, although she made films after that. She was also an important figure, or a somewhat important figure in the dance world. And she was an important person in a group called the New American Cinema Group that formed around 1960 that was trying to get outside of conventional financing for cinema, but still make more or less narrative films, the kinds of films you could get into a more or less typical theater. So she was in a somewhat different vein from the experimental people who were working sort of along the same time, and there were some bad feelings between them and her at some point. But Portrait of Jason is, as far as I'm concerned, her best film, and one of the most important films of the 60s. And it's really fortunate that we're getting this now. Milestone just did this new restoration of it and is just now distributing it. And it hasn't really had good distribution really almost ever. It's been a relatively difficult film to see. And so it's a really major film, you could say a milestone film. But it's not really as well seen as it should be. And it's a kind of documentary-ish thing that is a roughly 2-hour interview with this hustler named Jason Holiday, or supposedly named Jason Holiday, where it was originally a 12-hour interview that she and Carl Lee, who was for a while her husband, who was an actor in some of her films and a co-producer or writer in some of her films, they did this sort of 12-hour interview with him. He's drinking and smoking marijuana along the way, and so as it goes along, he gets progressively... his mood changes. And so he's for the most part a really good storyteller, and he's just sort of spieling off all these crazy things that have happened to him. But at some point there's a sort of shift, and the relationship between him and the interviewers, who you never actually see on camera but you hear them, there's a sort of growing tension between them. And so at some point it becomes a kind of critique of documentary, and as well as a kind of bizarro investigation of performance and performativity, because it's not fake, but it's not necessarily what you would call real either. And it's a really fascinating thing, and people should go see it.
Yeah. All right. That one sounds fascinating. That one's on my list now.
Good.
I'm going to go see that one. The next one listed here is on Friday, March 29th. It's called Empty Quarter. And the directors are going to be here.
Yes.
So tell me about this one.
I just saw this a couple months ago. We fortunately will have the directors here, Pam Minty and Alan Letourneau, who, in addition to making films, also operate a thing called 40 Frames, which is a sort of 16-millimeter film resource center of sorts, where you can get information about distributors and labs and equipment and all that sort of thing. But this film is a documentary portrait of southeastern Oregon, the empty quarter of Oregon, I guess people call it, or at least they call it, and of the people who work the land there, of people having social activities going on, people at restaurants, just sort of things that are going on in this landscape. And I don't know if you guys are familiar with James Benning. He's a major experimental filmmaker who makes a lot of these sort of slow landscape documentaries, very often, or pretty much always, from fixed camera positions with very long takes. He has a film called 13 Lakes, for instance, which is 13 10-minute shots of lakes from fixed camera positions. And this reminds me in some ways of Benning's work. It's fixed camera, it's long takes, but it has a little more overt sort of socio-political thematics to it, and maybe a little less of Benning's sort of aestheticism, because Benning has a socio-political interest, but if you've ever heard him talk about his work, he is, I would say, primarily, or first, he is an aestheticist, and second, he is a sort of social thinker. So that's what this film is. I think it's a really compelling thing for the kind of film that it is. It's a kind of film that a lot of people find kind of forbidding because you have to have patience with it. I think it's pretty accessible for that kind of film.
Yeah. Okay. Well, the next film listed here is Los Angeles Plays Itself, and this is a long one. This one's
it is long.
3.5 hours.
No, it's not that long. Isn't it like 2.5 hours?
Well, it says. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, 169 minutes. Okay. So yeah, I was confusing my minutes to hours ratio, but close to 3 hours. So what? Tell me what kind of film this is.
I don't know if you're familiar with Tom Anderson. He's a documentary maker, maybe best known for this or his film Edward Muybridge, Zoopraxographer. I think that's what it's
I
called.
think that's right, yeah.
Which is an amazing documentary about Edward Muybridge, who did the early time and motion studies, pre-cinematic time and motion studies. But it's a documentary about Los Angeles as a city in cinema, primarily in Hollywood city cinema. And it's made up entirely of clips from films.
Oh, okay.
With a voiceover by Anderson where he sort of talks about a whole lot of different things that he's interested in terms of how L.A. gets represented and becomes a kind of an actor, becomes a kind of a sign, becomes a kind of self-advertising, becomes a symbol of the West or the end of the West. He goes through a whole lot of different things on top of this montage of clips of L.A. from Hollywood films. And it's a really fascinating thing. And for an almost 3-hour film, it doesn't feel close to it. Like it's a really engaging, interesting thing. It's a fun kind of game to guess the film before tell you what the film is, kind of thing.
Interesting. It almost makes me think about something like Atomic Cafe, where it's literally just,
old
clips from educational films, and it tells the story beautifully of what it tells you what it's trying to say very clearly. But this. It doesn't. This says, you say this has a voiceover.
Yeah, he has a voiceover where he's very explicit about. Yeah, it's almost like it's not scholarly or academic at all in tone, but it's relatively serious. Like he's interested in certain themes and certain ways LA gets represented, reasons LA gets represented the way it does, that sort of thing.
Okay. Well, the next one, the final one listed here, Friday, April 26th at 6:30 p.m. Jean-Michel Kibushi shorts program. And I'm not familiar with this work.
I'm not either. This is something that Laura Ivans-Hully programmed. She's sort of our animation specialist.
Yeah.
I know that he is from Democratic Republic of Congo, and he uses a variety of different animation styles, from claymation to stop motion to regular hand-drawn animation. And my understanding, again, I haven't seen any of this work, and I don't know a lot about him, but my understanding is he is particularly engaged with parables, oral traditions, these sorts of things of the Congo, and how, sort of bringing those to light via animation can tell a certain kind of story or provide a certain kind of representation of the Congo, or engage with the history of the Congo, the historicization of the Congo, those sorts of things. I've seen some stills from the films. They look like he uses a lot of different styles, which is sort of unusual for a lot of animators who tend to work in somewhat characteristic styles. So I'm eager to see these.
Yeah. Well, I was just looking at the films I saw last semester, kind of maybe talk about some of them. I mean, the one that I remember most was the Svankmajer Shorts program.
Okay.
And one in particular, The Flat, which I thought was amazing. The Flat is about, it's this guy, and he's just in this room, and everything he touches and uses in a normal way breaks.
Right.
He gets a fork and he tries to, and all the tines just bend. Right. And, he picks up a glass and, something weird happens. And it just builds and builds and builds. And then he starts to get worried about, can I leave this room? And it becomes this bigger thing.
It has that sort of surrealistic thing that's common in Svankmajer.
Yeah. I think that was the main one I liked. The other ones were all kind of strange.
I'm not the world's biggest Svankmajer fan myself, but I have some reasonable familiarity with his work, and I like a fair number.
Yeah, I liked Meat Love well enough. Okay. That was sort of interesting. That was nice and short. The Garden was also a little interesting. I know it had something really deep to say. I don't know if I'm smart enough to understand what it was trying to say. Basically, this guy makes a fence out of other people, and it's like he's driving along with his friend and like talking about whatever random stuff, and gets to his house, and there's just a line of people standing there, and he walks up and he sort of like uses them as a gate, and they all sort of like walk out in a line, and then he drives his car in and walks them back, and they all walk back, and it's strange. I'm sure it has something very, very important to say, but I don't know exactly what it is.
I don't either.
I did see the Truly Filmic shorts, and I'm trying to remember them a little bit better. Looking for Langston, I didn't get. That's the one that I remember as like I just didn't quite latch on to that one in particular. Bridges Go Round was interesting, and Variations I liked.
Okay.
I liked Variations quite a bit. But Blue is the one that I really thought was special. And I don't remember if I saw his Super 8 films. I don't think I did. I don't have any memories of
His
it.
Super 8 films do have things besides the color blue in them.
Yes. And Blue was interesting because we saw it on film. And anytime you're looking at something on film, no matter how nice it is, there's a grain there.
Mm-hmm.
You know, if it was digital, I think it would be like a totally different experience because it would be perfectly clean.
Yeah, it's. I've seen it on 35 millimeter VHS and DVD. On VHS, it looks horrible because there's a lot of analog video stuff that the color goes off, and the whole thing is kind of an unpleasant experience. Honestly, on DVD, it's fine. It's best on film, but DVD, it's not bad on, certainly.
Yeah. And it's one of those films that when you don't have any visual, it's such a fascinating experience because you're watching the film, and if it was, I think it said originally it was like a radio play, and you could watch the color blue on your television if you wanted to, but it was played, it was like played on BBC radio, but you could also watch.
Let's go get like a color sample.
Yeah.
Stare at it.
You just watch that. But in a movie theater, you're forced to watch this. That's all you can see. That's the only thing. So it's a totally different experience. You can't sort of like look away and like, it's in the back of my head. It's all encompassing.
It is.
And it's so fascinating.
The blue does kind of take over the room for me anyway.
Yeah.
It's sort of like sometimes you'll watch films, like I watch a lot, abstract color film sorts of things, and you can sort of your eyes can stray off the screen if you're getting sort of bored with it or something. There's something about blue that even if you're not looking at the screen, it's still like that blue is over there.
Yes.
And it's like I'm going to have to re-engage with the blue at some point.
Yes. Well, I mean, there were these times when I was like forcibly like looking away and like shaking my head and like looking around at other people like everyone's still here and we're all still we're all safe. Everything's still happening. And then, but yeah, I would look up at the screen, and at first I started to see like these little pink flowy dots moving around, and I knew it wasn't part of the film. That was just what my eyes were telling me. And then at a certain point, the screen started moving towards me, and it was like filling my whole field of vision. And it was just such a, you don't have experiences like that at the movies normally. So that is one I will never forget.
I'm glad.
So anything else, Jason, you want to throw in?
It's unfortunate that I didn't get to see a lot of the films last year. I was very busy, but it seems like this year's lineup, or this semester's lineup, is very interesting. There are a few that actually have been added to my list.
Okay, good.
For sure. Actually, I can't think of one that I'm not at least curious about.
Yeah, I'm really happy with the order of our programs because it starts with, these shorts packages and the sort of introductory documentaries, and I think shorts packages are a really great way for people who aren't necessarily interested in avant-garde film to start out because they're 10 minutes long at
get away from
most.
them.
Right. I mean, and, even those of us who are really interested in this are not going to like everything there either. So it's kind of a sample. These sampler packs, I think, are useful.
Well, I'm definitely gonna check out Free Radicals for sure. I'm really interested in Festival Inappropriation and Portrait of Jason. The rest, Los Angeles Plays itself is also one that looks really interesting, but that's, I liked, I'm trying to expand myself.
Yeah.
I've never made a secret that this is not something this is not an interest I have. I like narrative film, if it's experimental, it's just not of interest to me, but I'm trying to get into it.
We've gotten you hooked on documentaries.
I'm down.
That's a small victory in
Documentaries I'm down with.
in my book.
Yeah. So, so experimental film, but I'm finding stuff I appreciate.
Well, if you were transfixed by blue, then I think you've already opened a door. A lot of people watch that film and are kind of find it very forbidding. But,
yes.
I'm glad that you had a good experience with it.
Yeah. So, all right. Well, Mark, thank you very much for joining us. We really appreciate it. Thank you guys for listening. We'll get out of here. I'm Andy.
And I'm Jason.
This has been, and always will be, A Place for Film. A Place for Film is recorded at WFIU Studios in Bloomington, Indiana.